Just Another Monster contains adult themes, violence, and content that may be sensitive to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Just Another Monster.
Hello?
This is Season 1, Episode 7 of Just Another Monster. This show where we shed light on the monsters that live among us. Greetings, listeners. I apologize for the delay in getting this episode released. I am sorry. Initially, I had planned to release these episodes on Halloween, but as luck would have it, life happens. Between intermittent power outages due to windstorms and some brief but annoying technical issues, I also came down with a mild head cold, and that landed directly on my face. This impacted my voice, and I sounded pretty gross, and honestly, no one wants to hear that. This episode was initially going to be split into 2 parts, but due to production issues, I've decided to release this as one single episode. But this also means the next episode will be out before the end of November. This case actually ended up being one of the most complex cases I have written about to date. The further down the rabbit hole I got, the more I realized just how much there was to it. It involves a brutal murder after a Halloween party, multiple suspects, a psychic, and a lot of whodunit. This case also discusses topics such as racism and sexual assault, so if you are sensitive to these kinds of subjects, I suggest skipping this episode. Alright, are you still with me? Okay, good. Well, let's get on with it. Sit back, relax, and let me tell you a story. A story of just another monster. This story starts in India. Arpana Jinaga was raised in Hyderabad, one of the considerably larger cities in India. She was the oldest of 2 daughters from her parents, Nirmala and B.C. Jinaga. Nirmala, her father, was a professor of computer science and engineering. Arpana had a strong affinity for the arts, poetry, and gymnastics starting at an early age, but in the end chose to follow the same path as her father in becoming a computer science engineer. As a teenager, she entered into an international computer programming competition. It was the IEEE Hardware Design Contest, and she won first prize. This caught the eye of numerous universities and potential employers. In 2005, at the age of 21, she gained international attention for her skills and proficiency with embedded systems when she entered into another contest run by a tech firm named Microchip. Each contestant was given a hardware design kit provided by Microchip to design an original piece of functional hardware. Arpana successfully developed an advanced wireless signal jammer that could disable wireless and cellular signals. Now, this did not win her the first prize for the contest, but it did make her a bit of a celebrity in Hyderabad as she was the only Asian in the contest among thousands of contestants. She did place in the top 20 though, and that's pretty impressive. Arpana was also featured in the New Indian Express. In an article titled Young Inventors, Arpana spoke of her passions for computers and technology and her desire to use them to innovate. She also spoke of dreams working for tech firms and possibly moving on to be a college professor herself, like her father. Shortly thereafter, Arpana attended a prestigious university in India. But Arpana wanted to spread her wings and reach for the stars, and she was someone who was very capable of doing so. So Arpana moved from her native India to New Jersey, where she attended Rutgers University. It was there that she earned her master's in electrical and computer engineering in the month of October of 2007. Sometime after graduating, Arpana made the move to the other side of the United States and found herself in Redmond, Washington. It's there that she landed a promising role at a major software development firm, Dell EMC. She hit the ground running at EMC and was considered a rising star. She was also a very active and adventurous person who was full of spirit and wanted to explore everything that life had to offer. For instance, she convinced her father to let her purchase a motorcycle. Never having ridden a motorcycle in her life, she was determined to learn. This is just the kind of person she was. So she took some motorcycle safety courses, trained, and got her license. And she even joined a local motorcycle group, the PNW Riders. She also took up martial arts, volunteered at several community organizations, such as one that cared for unwanted pets. She even joined the Redmond Fire Department as a volunteer. She had her hands in everything. This was someone who was really going to make something of herself. Arpana was also a very charismatic woman, someone who got along with everyone and made friends wherever she went. So when she moved to the Valley View apartments, she quickly became good friends with all of her surrounding neighbors. She found her home in Redmond, Washington. Redmond is a sprawling suburb on the east side of Lake Washington, just outside of Seattle. It's about a 20-minute drive across the floating bridge from downtown Seattle without traffic, about 92 hours with traffic. It was once a bit of a small town at the ass end of Interstate 520. My first experience of being in Redmond was in my senior year of high school. A buddy of mine landed an internship at the original Microsoft campus back in 1992. He would sneak us bricks of brand new blank 3.5-inch floppy disks, which were worth their weight in gold back then. In 1997, I found myself fleeing Seattle for a new start in Redmond myself. I just turned 22 and I was looking to jumpstart my career in tech once again, and that was the place to do it. It's been home to Microsoft since the 80s, then Nintendo, Google, and Facebook, and even Apple moved in. That's not even including the thousands of small tech startups peppering the region. What was once an old, swampy logging town quickly became one of the largest tech hubs in the United States. The original Microsoft campus is now overshadowed by its massive tech compound, complete with its own shuttle service. Some of the original residents moved further out into the rural areas towards Carnation and Duval, only to be replaced by young, bright-eyed college grads and tech industry professionals. Old historic homes and shops have been replaced with cookie-cutter apartment complexes and condos, kind of like Ballard. Some of the original historic Redmond still remains. Off of Leary Way is the old Redmond Trading Company, which is now a half-priced bookstore and a weed dispensary. Lampert's Butcher Shop, which opened in 1910, is now a popular dive bar known as Palmer's East, owned by my friend Tommy. I spent about 22 years of my life living in Redmond. It was centrally located and an easy commute to all of the tech firms that I worked at. As the town grew and expanded rapidly, so did the cost of living. I found myself living in various apartments and condos throughout the years. When one got too expensive, I moved to another one, and when that became more expensive, I again moved to another one. I was kind of doing a little bit of apartment shuffling back in the day. In 2015, by chance, I met a woman named Catherine who had just moved out here from Colorado. We had a great deal in common, and we instantly became really good friends. She lived just a few blocks away from where I was living at the time. My lease was up by the end of that year, and my rent was going to go from $1,700 a month for a 550 square foot unit to $2,500 a month. Suffice to say, it was time to get the fuck out. I was a little bit desperate to find something that was a little bit more affordable, so Catherine convinced me to move into her apartment complex as it was surprisingly cheap for the area. It was so cheap that I thought there had to be something wrong with it, like maybe it was haunted and I would be forever cursed by a ghost if I didn't help it with its unfinished business. The 20-unit, 3-story building was built in 1977, and it showed. There was no secured or gated entry. It had shared laundry and no real fire sprinkler system. The place was a tinderbox. But hey, $1,200 for a 2-bedroom with a deck and free parking? Yeah, I'll take it. So in the summer of 2016, I moved into the Valley View Apartments. That's right, the same apartment building that Arpana Jinaga moved into in 2008. Now, I should say, I was fully unaware of the story I am about to tell you before I moved to Valley View. It wasn't until I did some digging to try and find out why the apartment was so cheap that I read about Arpana and the infamous Halloween party. In late October of 2008, Arpana and some of the neighboring friends she made at Valley View wanted to throw an epic Halloween party. Now at the time, many of the residents at Valley View were made up of a younger crowd, so most of them were pretty much into it. This was a party that took place on all 3 floors of Valley View, and each of the 4 participating units was decorated with a different theme. Arpana's was decorated as a haunted forest. From what I've read, Arpana was excited, and she loved Halloween, and even more, she loved having a good time with her friends. On the night of the party, Halloween 2008, many of the tenants of Valley View hosted a revolving door of party guests dressed in their best Halloween costumes, many of them bouncing from one unit to the other. It was as if they turned the entire 3-story, 20-unit complex into a giant dorm room party. No one kept their doors shut or locked as people just hopped from one party to the other. Some people even poured out onto the deckway, a kind of outdoor hallway that ran across the front of all units. On this particular Halloween, Arpana dressed up as Little Red Riding Hood, and that evening, she had hosted guests in her own 1-bedroom haunted forest. Most of those who attended the party behaved themselves, and any of the rowdy ones were asked to leave, and they did so without incident. Guests and residents continued partying throughout the night. They spent their time laughing, admiring each other's costumes, doing shots of cheap vodka, and smoking weed. I think the goal of holding an epic Halloween party was accomplished. As the night wore on, some of the guests started to make their trek back home, probably realizing they were going to be in a world of hurt the next day. But many of the other visitors and close residents continued to party into the evening. One of those visitors was Emmanuel Fair. Now, at the time, Emmanuel was a 24-year-old who was crashing on the couch of a friend, another resident of Valley View. He had only been staying there for the weekend when he was invited to the party with everyone else. Since he was staying with one of the residents at Valley View, he ended up helping with a lot of the party decorations, even helping Arpana with her haunted forest theme. This is important as it's going to come up later. Emmanuel Fair grew up in the Central District of Seattle, just on the other side of Capitol Hill. As a child, he was raised by his grandmother along with his aunt and uncle. Unfortunately, his mother was a scarce presence in his life as she lived on the streets and had suffered from substance abuse issues. His mother was actually somewhat estranged from the rest of the family due to her own lifestyle choices. Fair would recall times where his mother would come to see him, but his grandmother would forbid him from opening the door. So the only communication he had with his mother was through the mail slot in the door. He remembers how he would leave for school in the morning only to find her sleeping on the porch of his grandmother's house. His mother had slept there so she can give him a hug before he left for school. Sadly, at the age of 16, Emmanuel's mother died. Now, it was assumed she died of an overdose initially. However, the coroner's report showed that she did not have alcohol or drugs in her system. She died in her sleep due to an enlarged heart, a condition that she likely developed after decades of alcohol and drug abuse. To say that Emmanuel had a challenging upbringing would be a bit of an understatement. After his mother passed, Fair's life began to spiral out of control. He started getting involved with gangs and drugs, and he was no stranger to the Seattle Police Department. His life on the streets earned him 4 felony convictions ranging from drug charges to 2 counts of third-degree rape of a minor. Fair was charged with the rape of a minor when he was 19 years old. A 14-year-old girl had accused him of choking and raping her at gunpoint. The charges resulted in Fair taking an Alford plea. The Alford plea is a legal mechanism that allows defendants to plead guilty while still asserting their actual innocence, particularly in cases where defendants concede that prosecutors have enough and sufficient evidence to secure a conviction and persuade a judge or jury to find the defendant guilty beyond reasonable doubt. You may have heard of this before, I'm sure. The West Memphis Three also entered into Alford pleas after serving 18 years and 78 days in prison for crimes they presumably did not commit. Fair served 4 years in prison for the rape charge and was later jailed again on a probation violation, as he failed to register as a sex offender. In October of 2008, Fair was making attempts to turn his life around. He was working on holding a stable job and moving away from the influence of gangs and drugs. It was that weekend of October 31st, 2008, that a friend of Emmanuel Fair's invited him to her place for the weekend, her place at the Valley View Apartments. Fair did not know that there was going to be a Halloween party until he got to Valley View, but while he was there, he got to know some of the residents and seemed to hit it off with everyone. He decided to make himself useful and helped with the decorations and preparation for the party. He helped by blowing up balloons and moving around tables and furniture, and even hung up some of the decorations in the various apartment units. 3 of the units involved in the party were on the lowest floor, the first floor. And then there were the 2 units on the top floor, the third floor. One of those units on the third floor was Arpana's. The other unit on the third floor that participated in the party was a neighbor of Arpana's. We're going to call him CJ. Now, CJ was actually late to the party. When he did show up, he was already heavily intoxicated. Now, there isn't a whole lot of info on CJ other than the fact that he shared a wall with Arpana and that they were friends. In fact, they would hang out together often at the beginning of their friendship. By his own admission, they seemed to have a very close relationship. However, over time, CJ and Arpana began to drift apart a bit. Arpana's time was consumed by work and her hobbies such as her motorcycle club and martial arts and volunteering. She even started to casually date one of her friends in the motorcycle club she belonged to. In the weeks leading up to the party, the apartment manager at the time recalled some comments that Arpana made about CJ. Now, CJ and Arpana used to wrestle together, and Arpana, who was trained in Taekwondo, could definitely hold her own. But Arpana stated that she chose to stop wrestling with CJ because he just doesn't stop, even when it was time to stop. But they still remained friends, maybe not as close as they were before, but they were still a presence in each other's lives to some degree. CJ had invited some friends and neighbors to his apartment, while Arpana entertained guests in hers next door. Many of the partygoers just bounced back and forth between the units. CJ and Fair had connected at the Halloween party as well, but it was a brief but friendly encounter. Both were into making music, and they shared some of their music with one another. At one point, they walked out to CJ's car to listen to some music, and afterwards parted ways. As things began to wind down, Fair went back down to the first floor to join the last few partygoers, but it was starting to get late. So he decided to turn in and headed over to his friend's unit to crash out. CJ ended up going back to his apartment around midnight to get some sleep himself. Eventually, the last few stragglers decided to go home. Arpana herself decided it was time to turn in at around 3 a.m. November 1st. and this would be the last time anyone would ever see Arpana alive again. Arpana hadn't been back home to visit her family in India in more than 2 years, but she had spoken to them very regularly and always kept in touch with them. The last time her family had heard from her was the night before the party, Thursday, October 30th. But the weekend following the party, no one could get a hold of Arpana. Calls went unanswered and no one ever received a call back. This was very much out of character for her. By Monday, November 3rd, Arpana failed to show up for work. One of Arpana's co-workers at EMC made numerous attempts to reach her, but they were unable to get through to her cell phone. At this point, Arpana's family in India was desperate to try and reach her, as they were fearing the worst. They ended up reaching out to a family friend, Jay, who lived in the area and he knew Arpana. Jay was close with Arpana's family and he was a former student of her father's. Arpana's family asked if Jay can go and check on her at her apartment in Valley View. Jay eventually arrived at the complex at around 9 a.m. Monday, November 3rd, 3 days after the party. When he began to make his way to Arpana's unit, Jay ran into CJ, who just happened to be nearby. Together, they decided to check on Arpana. When they knocked on her door, the door swung right open. It was evident that the door that led into the apartment was forced open, and the door jamb itself was broken. The doorknob and the padlock had still been locked from the inside. When they entered the apartment, they noticed everything was in complete disarray, and they observed a strong chemical smell. They slowly and eventually made their way to Arpana's bedroom. It was there that they made the horrifying discovery. Arpana's nude body, lying face down on her bedroom floor. Her body already in the process of decomposition, meaning she had been dead for a while. Jay then made the frantic call to 911, and both CJ and Jay spoke with the 911 dispatcher. The police arrived almost immediately, which makes sense as the Redmond Police Department is literally 2 blocks away from Valley View. When police arrived at the scene, they began getting statements from neighbors at the complex. As investigators started to catalog the crime scene, it was determined that the evidence they uncovered indicated a homicide. It was quickly determined that the assailant had forcefully kicked the door in, or at least forced their way through the door, as both the doorknob and padlock were still locked from the inside. It was also evident that there was a struggle that ultimately led to Arpana's bedroom, where her body was discovered. Arpana's body lied face down near her bed, completely nude and covered in blood. Her body appeared to be covered in numerous types of liquids that included toilet bowl cleaner, bleach, and motor oil. It was also noted that when police arrived, they too noticed the strong smell of chemical agents throughout the unit. As they continued to process the scene, they noticed bleach stains on the furniture and a table in the living room. Inside Arpana's bathroom, investigators would find a white comforter soaking in a mixture of water and bleach in the bathtub. Many other items throughout her apartment had been partially burned, including the red cape she wore as part of her costume, portions of the carpet, a black satin sheet, and a green blanket. In the shared dumpster located in the parking lot of Valley View, investigators discovered a plastic bag that contained an empty bottle of motorcycle oil, parts of Arpana's Halloween costume, a blood-stained bathrobe, and sheets from Arpana's bed, which also happened to be missing from the crime scene. But one thing investigators could not find was a witness. Investigators had interviewed most of the neighbors that lived at Valley View, including those that attended the Halloween party the previous evening. One of Arpana's next-door neighbors had heard a dull moaning coming from Arpana's apartment at around 3 a.m., and then the sound of running water shortly after. It was assumed she was just having sex and maybe took a shower after, so the neighbor just went back to sleep. Another neighbor had stated at around 8 a.m. November 1st, he was awakened by a horrible growling sound that continued for about 20 seconds, and was then punctuated by a solid and significant thud sound. Moments after, he reported hearing the sound of running water coming from Arpana's apartment that continued on for at least an hour. This neighbor didn't really think much of the odd noises he heard coming from Arpana's apartment, and it makes sense. I can tell you myself firsthand, having lived at Valley View for over 3 years, just below the unit Arpana used to live in, that I heard weird noises all the time. Creaks from the ceiling above me, water running, doors opening and closing, and all of this drowned out by a river of traffic just outside of the apartments. As I mentioned before, these apartments are old and the walls are thin, but each unit also faces outward toward the Bella Bottega shopping center, and right before that, the Redmond-Woodinville Road. The Redmond-Woodinville Road is a main arterial road that connects downtown Redmond to Woodinville. It is one of the busiest roads coming in and out of Redmond. Everything from semi-trucks to commuters use this road 24/7. Also, every apartment at Valley View has a large sliding glass door that faces this loud and busy road. So loud and oftentimes weird noises are commonplace when living there. Over time, you just kind of get used to it. Investigators continued interviewing witnesses and going over evidence at the scene. The idea that this was a robbery gone bad was one of the angles investigators had considered, as they noticed some items from Arpana's apartment were missing. One of Arpana's ID cards, her BlackBerry, and her digital camera were nowhere to be found. Now, investigators were later able to pull cell phone data from the BlackBerry, but these items were never recovered. This led detectives to believe that the person that broke in, assaulted Arpana, and murdered her was someone she knew. The results of Arpana's autopsy, which was performed by the King County Medical Examiner's Office, were released on November 6, 2008. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, and the time of her death was determined to be sometime between 3 a.m. and 8 a.m. November 1st, 2008. It had appeared that Arpana was strangled to death by a bootlace, but this was not the extent of her injuries. Arpana had suffered numerous injuries prior to her death, which included blunt force blows to her head and face, resulting in several broken teeth. This was a very violent assault. She had also been gagged with her own underwear, which was kept in place by duct tape. And she was forcibly raped for an unknown extent of time. Her body was also covered in motor oil, bleach, and an acidic toilet bowl cleaner. Her hands were actually stained with a blue hue, as it was determined this was the result of the toilet bowl cleaner. And to top it off, this monster attempted to set her body on fire and partially burned some of the items belonging to Arpana. It's assumed that the monster responsible was attempting to destroy any DNA evidence that was present. Lieutenant Brian Coates would later tell reporters about the crime scene.
It was a scene where the suspect or suspects spent a considerable amount of time covering the evidence of crime. It was a brutal scene. It was gruesome. I hope I never have to investigate a case like this again.
Over the course of several weeks, investigators continued to question family members, friends, and neighbors with a particular interest in the Halloween party that preceded her death. Unfortunately, this did not result in any new leads or information, and it continued this way for months. By January of 2009, it was reported that the case began to stall. Investigators continued to be optimistic, however, as they still had a measurable amount of physical evidence that they were patiently waiting to be processed. Lieutenant Doug Shepard of the Redmond Police Department had stated to the Bellevue Reporter,
"We're a safe community. This sort of thing doesn't happen in Redmond. We have a brutal murder with no suspect. This one is not going away. We're not going to put this to bed. We still consider it early in the investigation. A lot of stuff has not been analyzed yet. It's the #1 priority in the division. We're not giving up."
he continued.
"She did not make enemies. She just made friends, and a lot of them. There is no apparent reason why someone would want to take this person from the prime of her life."
As time went on, New leads were scarce, and witnesses, neighbors, or friends were exhaustively interviewed. The case was stalling, and it continued this way for 2 years. Investigators were desperate to find their suspect and solve this case. As mentioned before, this kind of thing just didn't happen in Redmond. Redmond is a fairly affluent area where things like shoplifting and car break-ins dominate the town's crime statistics. Brutal murders were just something that never happened there. Investigators were so desperate, they even implored the services of a psychic. They hired Alison Dubois, the world-famous psychic who was the main subject of the television show Medium, who was portrayed by Patricia Arquette. Now, I don't know if any of you believe in psychic abilities or astral projection or any of that, and whether or not I do is neither here nor there. However, as an investigator on this case, I don't think I could, in good faith, rely on the predictions of a psychic to determine a suspect in this case. But since things like brutal murders were not commonplace in Redmond, after going over this case more in depth, it was clear to me that the detectives involved were in way over their heads. I just don't think they had the experience or capacity to effectively handle a case like this. And the more I tell you about this case, you'll see what I mean. In 2010, King County officials held a press conference to announce that they have arrested a suspect in Arpana Jinaga's murder. This suspect was Emmanuel Fair. In the weeks after Arpana's murder, Emmanuel Fair was questioned by police after he was identified through several photographs that were taken at the Halloween party. When he spoke with investigators, he had admitted to being in Arpana's apartment before and during the Halloween party. He was identified through photographs because when his friend who lived at Valley View was questioned, she had stated she was alone that weekend. She lied about the presence of Emmanuel. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that she did this to protect him. Knowing his prior history with the King County Police Department, it makes sense. Emmanuel had stated that he met Arpana for the first time that same day, and that they seemed to get along just fine. She showed him some photos from her computer that was located in her bedroom, but that was about the extent of their interactions together. The Redmond Police Department didn't have any incriminating evidence that linked Fair to the crime. However, due to his prior criminal history, he had always been considered a person of interest from the get-go. However, when the forensic results finally came back from the Washington State Crime Lab, there seemed to be enough evidence to implicate Emmanuel Fair's involvement in Arpana's murder. Charges were filed against Emmanuel Fair for the murder of Arpana Jinaga. At the time that it was announced that Fair was being charged with their murder, Fair was already incarcerated at the McNeil Island Correction Center in Steilacoom for failing to update his sex offender registration. The incriminating evidence the police used as their smoking gun was DNA evidence that had been recovered from the scene of the crime. The pieces of evidence included DNA recovered from the tape used to gag Arpana, DNA from her neck, and DNA from the bloody robe that was found in the dumpster. However, this DNA was considered to be trace DNA. Trace DNA, otherwise known as touch DNA, is defined by small traces of DNA that can be detected on objects that have been touched or casually handled. It only requires about 7 or 8 skin cells from the outermost layer of skin. Using trace DNA is highly criticized, as it is prone to high rates of false positives due to contamination. For example, fingerprint brushes used by crime scene investigators can transfer trace amounts of skin cells from one surface to another, leading to inaccurate results. And due to the very high risk of false positives, trace DNA is more often used by the defense to help exonerate a suspect rather than to prove their guilt through prosecution. Armed with the DNA evidence and coupled with the inconsistencies of Fair's story and his previous criminal history, detectives felt this was enough to charge him. Emmanuel had stated that the evening of the Halloween party, he went back to his friend's apartment to sleep. This was at around 1 a.m. However, cell phone records indicated that Fair had made dozens of phone calls to numerous women between the hours of 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. This included several calls to Leslie, the woman who lived in the apartment he was staying in. Speaking to the press, King County Senior Deputy Prosecutor Jeff Baird claimed,
"The defendant opened the locked door to Jinaga's apartment, attacked her, stripped her of her clothing, gagged her, and assaulted her, and then finally strangled her to death."
Emmanuel Fair was now facing first-degree murder charges, and the prosecution vehemently stated that they would be seeking life in prison for Fair due to the brutal nature of the murder. Emmanuel Fair entered into a plea of not guilty. In the following months and years following Fair's arrest, his defense attorneys focused on the improper treatment of Fair under the law. From the get-go, the investigators assigned to this case, along with the prosecution, set their sights on Fair. Now, one of the key factors in this case is something I intentionally left out until this part of the episode, and that is the fact that Emmanuel de Melvin Fair is a black man. Now, first of all, I am in no way ignoring Emmanuel Fair's sordid and violent past by any means. He is a multiple felon and a sex offender. However, in regards to some other information that has come out in regards to this case, I can see where Fair's defense team was coming from. For instance, around the same time that this crime occurred, the federal government had deemed that the Seattle Police Department was overly discriminatory towards minors and those of lower socioeconomic status. It was alleged that the prosecution, along with the investigators, had treated Emmanuel unfairly, especially when compared to the other potential suspect or person of interest. That's right, there was indeed another suspect. And this suspect was casually asked to come into the precinct to make a statement, as where Emmanuel Fair was brought in at gunpoint. And that suspect was none other than CJ, Arpana's concerned next-door neighbor. In fact, there was a great deal of evidence that implicated CJ, not to mention circumstantial evidence coupled with some strange and highly suspicious decisions he made shortly after Arpana's murder. So we'll go back to the beginning a little bit here. As I mentioned before, CJ had also attended the Halloween party, but he showed up late and highly intoxicated. When he was being interviewed by investigators, he had told them that he had a strong sexual attraction to Arpana, and that was likely not reciprocated. He even stated in his own words that he was looking to hook up with her that night. In one of the interviews he had with police, he stated, "She looked really good. I hadn't seen her for months. I never thought about her like that before." CJ had stated that he went back to his apartment around midnight to go to sleep. However, his phone records would indicate that he called Arpana twice a few hours later, once at 2:56 a.m. and a second time at 3:02 a.m. It's theorized that CJ made the calls in hopes to have sex with Arpana. These were also the last known calls to Arpana's phone that morning. When he was questioned about the calls, CJ claimed to not remember making them at all, but when police mentioned that they had obtained a log of his phone calls from his cell phone provider, CJ responded with an audible, "Oh crap," but he continued to claim ignorance on the matter. Before the detectives could obtain a warrant for CJ's BlackBerry, it had been wiped of all call and text data. Just one of the many mishaps, or oversights as they call them, when it came to handling CJ as a person of interest. Now, as I mentioned earlier, many witnesses stated they saw Arpana head back to her apartment at around 3 a.m., and then shortly after, moaning could be heard coming from her apartment. One of those witnesses that made that statement was CJ, who had claimed he fell asleep on his couch, which was also positioned up against the wall he shared with Arpana. He had stated he was awoken by the noise of Arpana having sex with someone else at 3 a.m., but fell back to sleep until about 10 a.m. However, his phone calls would indicate that that was a false statement. Another witness who lived at Valley View had worked late nights and had returned home at around 3 a.m. This witness had not attended the Halloween party, but this witness had told police that they saw an individual standing in the doorway to Arpana's apartment. The description they gave closely resembled that of CJ and not Emmanuel Fair. When investigators asked CJ if he had gone to Arpana's apartment after making the phone calls, his response was simply,
I don't think so.
On the morning of November 1st, just hours after Arpana was believed to have been murdered, CJ claims he woke up at around 10 a.m. However, detectives had uncovered evidence that would prove otherwise. A check of his online activity had shown that CJ had printed out maps to local pawn shops in the area. Remember when I mentioned earlier that Arpana's digital camera and BlackBerry were missing? Then that same morning, CJ decided to take a drive up to Canada. Yeah, you heard that right. CJ just decided to randomly make the 3-hour drive up north to the Canadian border. In fact, reports show that he attempted to blow right past the border crossing without stopping. Border officials were able to quickly stop CJ and searched his vehicle. He was then turned away as he did not have a passport with him. I don't think he really thought this through. When Redmond detectives asked him about his impromptu jaunt up to Canada, he told police that he was just
kind of wanting to explore.
He offered no other further explanations for this behavior. And remember, this was literally after Arpana was murdered, before her body was discovered. Now, after being turned away at the border, CJ had attended a party at a friend's house just north of Redmond in the city of Everett. Witnesses at the party had stated that CJ had a very noticeable limp, which investigators also noted days after Arpana's murder. CJ stated that his limp was the result of a wrestling match at the party, yet he appeared to have arrived at the party with the limp already. This was later determined by investigators to be an attempt at covering up an unexplained injury by CJ. And if that wasn't enough already, then you have the witnesses, friends, and family that had shared their own concerns and statements about CJ with investigators. For starters, CJ had stopped taking his psychiatric medication in the weeks or months leading up to Arpana's murder. This was medication that was prescribed to him for an undefined mood disorder. The investigators never followed up on this or looked into what mental health condition the medication was prescribed to treat. Also, within days of Arpana's murder, CJ had also made some very alarming comments to his friends and neighbors. For example, he had asked his friends and neighbors if he could have killed Arpana and not remembered, or if he had wandered over to her apartment in his sleep and killed her. Yeah, you heard that correctly. He asked if it was possible if he killed her and not remembered, or he did it in his sleep. Let that sink in for a moment. Friends and neighbors, at least 3 of them, had expressed concern that CJ could have been the one to commit the murder, especially considering that CJ appeared to have become resentful of Arpana and her new friendships in the weeks leading up to the murder. When asked by investigators, CJ couldn't even recall whether or not he kicked in Arpana's door. I mean, I imagine that that would be something that you could recall pretty clearly even if you are blitzed out of your fucking mind. He also couldn't recall why he had printed out maps and locations of different pawn shops in the area the morning of Arpana's death. Over the course of the next couple of years since Arpana's murder, CJ would be interviewed several times by investigators, but never charged or even named as suspect, and we haven't even gotten to the DNA evidence yet. Some of the items recovered from Arpana's apartment and the dumpster, for example, the bloody robe, pieces of Arpana's costume, the tape, all had Emmanuel's trace DNA, but it also had CJ's trace DNA. In fact, the same amount of trace DNA on those items that belonged to Emmanuel also belonged to CJ. The probability that the DNA had belonged to both parties was incredibly high, but for some reason, well, I mean, honestly, let's just face it here. I mean, for obvious reasons, Emmanuel was the only one charged with Arpana's murder or stood trial for it. Crime scene investigators actually found the DNA of several men in Arpana's apartment. More than a dozen people had been in and out of Arpana's apartment that evening alone. There was even DNA discovered in her apartment that didn't belong to anyone that attended the party. They even discovered DNA from an unnamed neighbor on the bootlace thought to have been used to strangle Arpana. But this neighbor had a rock-solid alibi and didn't even attend the party at all. There was even semen that was discovered on a hand towel near Arpana's body. The DNA from the semen belonged to an unnamed friend who was having a casual relationship with Arpana and wasn't even in town when the party took place. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Trace DNA is unreliable. Think about it. You could lose your phone only for it to be found by someone who sold it on Craigslist, and then that phone ends up at a murder scene. And the next thing you know, you're getting a phone call from the homicide investigators. Now, people might be asking, what about the blood on the robe? And yeah, that's a good question. Well, during the party, Fair had a small accident that left him with a bloody lip. Honestly, it wasn't really much of an accident at all. You see, at one point during the party, Emmanuel and CJ were doing a little bit of dick measuring in the parking lot of Valley View in the form of a little playful sparring. This was corroborated by several witnesses, and Emmanuel had used Arpana's bathroom to clean himself up. And you might ask yourself, what about the DNA on the duct tape? Well, Fair was helping set up the decorations before the party, even the haunted forest in Arpana's unit. So there were explanations for Fair's or even CJ's trace DNA to be in Arpana's apartment. Now, to give you a few numbers here, the samples taken from Arpana's neck was shown to be about 3,803 times more likely to be a combination of Fair and Arpana's DNA than that of Arpana and another random person. The DNA on the robe showed to be about 120 to 1,000 times more likely to be a mixture of Fair and Arpana's DNA than Arpana and another random person. However, the DNA taken from the motor oil bottle purchased by Arpana, along with her robe in the dumpster, contained a mixture of DNA that was 120 million times more likely to be that of Arpana's and CJ's. But for some reason, some inexplicable reason, prosecutors felt there was not enough evidence to charge CJ, even though the same DNA evidence was used to charge Emmanuel Fair. Does that sound a bit strange to you? Here, I'll say it without saying it. How's that? Do you remember when I spoke about the former apartment manager that told investigators about CJ and Arpana's wrestling bouts? Well, after Fair was charged with Arpana's murder, the former apartment manager of Valley View had rescinded her earlier statements about CJ. She stated that she would have never accused CJ if she had known that there was this big black guy there. Now, to be clear, I am not accusing Redmond PD and its homicide detectives of racism, but I cannot discuss this case without addressing the proverbial elephant in the room. And that is the fact that we are still, to this day, dealing with rampant systemic racism and classism within our justice system. There's just no getting around that fact. As the trials for Emmanuel Fair moved forward, detectives continued to press on CJ, who had since lawyered up. Now, in the beginning, the prosecution's case was that of a single killer who broke in, sexually assaulted Arpana, and then attempted to destroy DNA evidence. But the prosecution had course corrected and had stated that Emmanuel may not have acted alone. The prosecution referred to an uncharged accomplice when it came to the matter. The uncharged accomplice, likely referring to CJ. The prosecution stated,
"The state's position is that CJ may have participated in the crime with Fair, and that the evidence implicating CJ does not exculpate Fair. Rather than an other suspect, CJ can also be characterized as an uncharged accomplice."
Detective Coates and the prosecution had met with CJ and his criminal defense attorney John Howard Brown in attempts to jar CJ's memory about that night. They made numerous attempts to try and strike CJ from the dwindling list of suspects, but they were unsuccessful. CJ continued to assert that he didn't remember what happened that night. In August of 2010, Detective Coates approached CJ again, asking if he could do anything
to shake a memory loose that could help you be a better witness for us and not be such an asset for the defense.
I really wish I had something I could, but I just don't. I don't know.
He replied. Documents also revealed that CJ continued to question whether he could have forgotten kicking in Arpana's door the night of the murder. You know, it's mind-boggling to me, really, that CJ, who appeared to have potential motive, whose DNA was 120 million times more likely to be his, all over key pieces of evidence, who fled to Canada and attempted to blow past border security, who cannot remember if he kicked in Arpana's door, and even asked his friends and neighbors if he could have sleptwalked into Arpana's apartment that night and killed her, and not to mention, shown to be lying about the time he went to sleep that night with the phone records to prove it, was given immunity during some of his initial interviews with detectives. This is what Fair's attorneys meant by unfair treatment of their client, and I think I paint a very clear picture of what that means. Fair's attorneys had focused on several shortcomings when it came to the performance investigators in this case during the 2 years they had singled out Fair as the only suspect. This includes investigators' use of a psychic to help guide them in the right direction. I mean, if you're desperate enough to hire a psychic to help you with your case, you're grasping. And if you're grasping, you simply don't have enough. And nothing against psychics or anything, but I mean, if a psychic were to name someone or discover clues that could name someone, it wouldn't necessarily be admissible in court. The defense also pointed out that the items pulled from the dumpster used to implicate Fair were discovered 2 days after the discovery of Arpana's body. And now remember, Arpana's body wasn't discovered until Monday the 3rd, and she was presumably killed between 3 a.m. Halloween night and 8 a.m. the following morning, November 1st. That means the items found in the dumpster used to implicate Fair were exposed to cross-contamination for nearly a week. And I will tell you now, as someone that lived at Valley View, there has only been one dumpster for the entire complex, and it's not a big one. Emmanuel Fair's trial began in February of 2017, more than 6 years after he was initially charged and more than 8 years after Arpana's murder. The prosecution would portray Fair as a criminal repeat offender who became sexually infatuated with Arpana after meeting her that evening. Fair, who had made earlier claims that he went back to his friend's apartment to sleep at around 1 a.m., was shown to have made phone calls, nearly 24 of them in fact, to 3 separate women between the hours of 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. None of the women he called were Arpana. One of these women received 3 phone calls from Fair, and they were time-stamped at around 4:45 a.m. She had stated the calls had gone straight to her voicemail. She recalled one of those voicemails sounding like constant movement on the other end, so basically a butt dial. But nothing was said verbally during the entire voicemail. Fair himself didn't remember making the calls and claims he may have done so by accident. Fair's defense attorneys contest the state's claims that he acted alongside an accomplice, citing that Fair was not on trial for crimes that he and someone else committed. They stated that any evidence proving Fair's guilt should be considered. However, using evidence proving the involvement of an uncharged accomplice would only raise reasonable doubt that Fair was involved in the murders at all. In short, Emmanuel Fair was the only person facing charges, and you cannot legally charge someone for crimes that 2 separate individuals presumably committed. It's unconstitutional. After only 2 months after the trial first began, it ended with a hung jury. They were sent back for further deliberation, which resulted in a split decision, 6 for guilty and 6 for not guilty. 5 of those believed that CJ was involved. Eventually, the case ended in a mistrial. Almost immediately after the mistrial, the prosecution made plans to retry Emmanuel for Arpana's murder, because of course they would. However, the trial was placed on hold for discretionary review by the Court of Appeals. The evidence against CJ was overwhelming. The amount of evidence implicating CJ made it impossible for investigators and the prosecution to rule out CJ as a suspect. Emmanuel Fair's second trial began in 2019, 11 years after Arpana's murder. Again, the state relied heavily on the DNA evidence that they had. Emmanuel's defense team, Benjamin Goldsmith and Catherine Edwards, focused on generating reasonable doubt by focusing on CJ as the primary suspect. Aside from the fact that there was just so much evidence against CJ, if not more, coupled with his odd and inexplicable behaviors after Arpana's murder, it seemed that CJ was the likely and probably should have been the only suspect. And then you couple that with the fact that CJ also had a prior relationship with Arpana, one that seemed to be strained in the weeks leading up to her murder. This could provide potential motive. Emmanuel Fair had only met Arpana the evening of the party, hence no real potential motive outside of the prosecution's theories. CJ was never available for cross-examination, but he was brought to the stand during Fair's second trial. This is because the prosecution was unwilling to grant CJ immunity, as they did with some of his earlier interviews. CJ was also granted the privilege of only being asked a limited set of questions, as there was no way that CJ could testify without incriminating himself, since he was no longer being considered an uncharged suspect at this point. The 12 members in the jury in this case began deliberation on Thursday, June 6, 2019. They initially found themselves deadlocked, again. However, on Tuesday, June 11th, the jury finally came to a clear consensus and they delivered this to the judge. Emmanuel Fair was found not guilty in the murder of Arpana Jinaga. One of the jurors had spoken to the Seattle Times after the trial. They stated that the state was unable to reconcile charges against Fair while also having overwhelming evidence against CJ. This provided enough reasonable doubt to come to a conclusion that Fair was not guilty. The juror stated,
I think that was the biggest reasonable doubt, and no one could eliminate him as the killer. We found Emmanuel Fair not guilty because of reasonable doubt, not because we thought he was completely innocent.
Emmanuel Fair was now 35 years old. He spent over 9 years waiting to hear those words, not guilty. Fair was released from custody just hours after the verdict, and he was acquitted of all charges in the brutal murder of Arpana Jinaga. While this case has not received the national attention it should have, it is far from being closed. There have been other theories and potential suspects that Emmanuel's defense team have presented, and one of those people was Mark Patrick O'Leary. O'Leary is an Army veteran, home invader, and serial rapist who was active at the time. He was actually the subject of the Netflix series Unbelievable. He was arrested for numerous rapes and assaults in Colorado and Washington. During the month of October 2008, Mark Patrick O'Leary was active in Washington state. In fact, during an interview with O'Leary by Emmanuel's defense attorney, O'Leary admitted to being in the area around Arpana's murder. Apparently, he even lived in the same area and admitted to casing apartment complexes in Redmond around the same time. And some of the methods used were familiar signatures of O'Leary's. For example, O'Leary would use bootlaces to incapacitate his victims. However, O'Leary has never admitted to murdering Arpana Jinaga. O'Leary has also never killed any of his victims. O'Leary was arrested and has been linked to at least 5 serial rapes between Colorado and Washington, but it's very likely he had more victims. O'Leary used to photograph and document his victims. He would even keep items from his victims as a kind of trophy or memento. These would usually be in the form of a cell phone or a digital camera. He could have also very easily committed this murder. He also could have done it completely undetected. There is actually a small path to the right side of the complex right off of the sidewalk in front of it. Arpana's unit is directly in front of a walkway from the complex's parking lot and up a small flight of stairs. So O'Leary could have easily walked up right off the street and directly into Arpana's unit and left the same way he came, completely undetected. When O'Leary was arrested, investigators came into possession of a heavily encrypted 75-gigabyte hard drive that belonged to O'Leary. Investigators have nicknamed the hard drive the Wretch. Investigators believe the drive contains more incriminating evidence against O'Leary, probably containing photographs and other data from his victims. Victims that investigators are not aware of. Unfortunately, the drive is yet to be cracked, and O'Leary has refused to provide access to investigators, even after being arrested and sentenced to life in prison. Now, aside from O'Leary, there is still a mountain of evidence against CJ. In fact, the bulk of evidence in possession of Redmond police points to CJ, and he has yet to be charged with any involvement in Arpana's murder. As of today, the case remains unsolved, and as of now, it appears there has been little to no activity in regards to the investigation. I feel that this was a situation where detectives and the prosecution went all in on a man with a record, a black man who was of lower socioeconomic status, who was less likely to afford legal counsel, someone who was trying to escape his own past, only to walk right into the path of a situation wrought with unfortunate timing and circumstances. Again, I am in no way defending Fair or his past by any means, but just because he was guilty of one crime does not make him automatically guilty of another. Recently, interest in this case has increased. In fact, there is another podcast that was released in August 2021 covering this case. This show, Suspect, is a 10-part series hosted by the journalists Matthew Shear and Eric Benson. I think in the wake of cases like those of Gabby Petito or Shimika Cozy, I think it's time we pull some focus to this case in hopes of bringing Arpana's murderer to justice. Now, there is one key thing I wanted to mention. It's something that none of the other handful of other podcasts about this specific case have touched on. And it's very likely something that would have been easily overlooked had they not actually lived at Valley View. So at the very beginning of the episode, I mentioned that I used to live at Valley View Apartments. I lived there for just a little over 3 years. I got to know the complex and my neighbors pretty well. Some of them I still call friends to this day. After reading about this case, there was always one thing that kind of stood out to me. Actually, it's something that wasn't there, that always kind of ate at me. And it involves the partially burnt items that belonged to Arpana. Now, I also mentioned earlier that the apartment complex is old and does not have any kind of emergency sprinkler system in place in the event that there's a fire. If there was a fire, the apartment building would light up like a tinderbox, and that is no exaggeration. Everyone that lives there knows this. Actually, all of the neighbors are very keen on this fact, and they watch out for each other in regards to that. If my smoke detector went off, I would have a neighbor pounding on my door to make sure everything was okay, and this happened more than a few times. While I was living there, one of my neighbors had a small fire on their deck. Once the alarms finally went off, everyone was outside of their units, working to put out the fire and minimize the damage before the Redmond Fire Department arrived. Now, some of Arpana's belongings, such as her costume and sheets, were partially burnt, along with small portions of her carpet. It was as if someone started to burn them, but then quickly put them out. I don't think this monster was trying to use motor oil to set anything on fire. I think that was just an attempt to destroy as much DNA evidence as possible. But why make attempts to burn some of the items in her apartment, only to snuff them out almost immediately after the fact? If it was a stranger off the street that did this, they likely would have just let everything burn. Unless the monster that did this knew that if they let the items burn, it would have ignited the entire building. Knew that if the fire alarms went off, everyone in the complex would come out to aid in putting out the fire. It's as if they knew there was no sprinkler system in place to put it out. It's as if they knew this because they themselves were a tenant at Valley View. Chew on that one for a little bit. It's been 2 years now since Emmanuel Fair was acquitted, 13 years since Arpana's murder. Many friends, neighbors, and co-workers have come together to mourn the senseless loss of their friend and colleague, and they've also come together to celebrate the life of Arpana Jinaga, a woman with a bright future, a woman who had dreams to make the world a better place. Arpana was the model definition of a strong, independent, and successful woman. She is one of those rare people who could literally accomplish anything they set their minds to. She had that drive and that tenacity. I like to imagine that, had she lived, I imagine she would have inspired young women to follow their own passions, whether it was for the arts or for the sciences. She would have helped pave the way for so many young women in so many ways. And as a professor, she would have aided in the development of great young minds across the globe. And sadly, those are dreams that were taken away from Arpana the moment that her life was taken away from us. Sadly, to this day, Arpana's family have not yet been able to be here to mourn the loss of their talented, loving, and exuberant daughter and sister, and they still await her justice, and I hope it comes soon. Thank you for listening to Season 1, Episode 7 of Just Another Monster. Remember, if you are a fan of the show, please subscribe and tell your friends about the show. Also, you can follow me on Instagram at A Monster Show, and leave a comment. Tell me what you think about the episode. Do you think Emmanuel is actually guilty? Do you think that it was a random person off of the street, or do you think it was Arpana's neighbor CJ? Let me know what you think. Until next time, stay safe and take care of each other.